Hello there, listening audience. This is Michael Cross here with another episode of Unlock the Door Radio on UCY TV. Tonight, we have a really interesting guest. He is a professor of psychiatry and human behavior at the School of Medicine, the University of California. He's done a lot of research on how the brain works, but also he's noted for a lot of information in regards to psychopathology. And that is none other than James Follen. Hello, James.
Michael, it's good to be here. How you doing?
Oh, excellent. Just enjoying the summer weather. Hey, I was wondering, there's a lot of interviews out there in which you've told your story, but I think our listening audience would probably like to hear a little bit. And that is, how in the world did you start getting interested in the topic of psychopaths?
Well, I really got into it because my colleagues in neurology and psychiatry, we had just gotten a PET scanner back in the early 1990s. And because of that technology, and because I also taught some of these students who are then now psychiatrists and radiologists, they started to study serial killers, really bad guys. And during the penalty phase of these trials, they wanted to be shown to have something wrong with their brain. So they had the defense team brought them in, they did PET scans, and then I was asked to come in and take a look and try to analyze it. So I was doing that 1 or 2 a year, but it was not my main research at all, even though I've done a lot of analysis of brains in general. And at that time, until about the mid-2000s, 2004, 2005, I was getting 1, 2, 3 a year to look at. But then I had several colleagues send me fMRIs, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and PET scans, positron emission tomography scans, and SPECT scans, and they all came within 1 year. And so I had a whole pile of them. And I had never known of or heard of a pattern to a psychopath's brains, and in this case they were murderers, but it was a mix of murders. Some were impulsive and some were psychopathic. But at any rate, in looking through it, I saw a pattern, and then I became interested in kind of the science of it. And so I started to put together what I looked like the circuitry that was common to the psychopaths. And so what came out, the neuroanatomy of that, was that they had a part of their brain system called the limbic system. The emotional brain was turned off pretty much in all of them. And even though they had other damage, because some of these murders, they've been hit over the head as kids, they get into fights, there's drug and alcohol stuff, they have different kinds of damage, but they all have this core damage. So I started to give talks about it to test it out, with people in neuroscience and in law schools, etc. And at the same time, in 2005, I just happened to be doing in our lab a study of Alzheimer's disease. So we needed normal people because we had our Alzheimer's patients already PET scanned and also their genetics done. So I was one of the controls, the normals. And when they came back, this pile of normal brains that was part of the Alzheimer's study, I was sitting there at my desk, and I had a whole pile of the murderers on one side, and the technician brought in these other scans for the Alzheimer's, and I skimmed through them very quickly, and I got to the bottom scan, and I could tell immediately something was really wrong with this person. And I asked the technician, I said, check the scanner, because obviously this is one of the murders. This is a psychopath pattern. And they checked it. They went, no. So I had to really check this normal person, and I pulled back the sticker that covers the name because I do these things blindly, and it was me. And so that started a series of events that kind of changed my life.
Okay, so it was one of those epiphany moments, like, uh-oh. So what did you do?
Well, it's one of those moments where, Gandalf shows up at your door, and you turned out to be Gandalf, and it's, purely serendipitous.
So if that happened to me, I think I would start asking around and seeing what people thought, and apparently that's what you did too.
Well, at first I laughed. When I first saw it, I laughed, and I didn't take it seriously at all. And I said, well, something, I just kind of blew it off. I just laughed it off, actually, for a couple of years. And because consider myself a normal person. So I said, well, maybe there's something else going on here. It has something to do with the genetics. And I really, when the genetics came back about a year and a half later, all of them, it also was very consistent with a very violent, aggressive person with low interpersonal emotional empathy. That is, somebody who was unempathetic, uncaring. And I still kind of laughed it off. And I'm a self-diagnosed normal person. And so it wasn't until I was asked to give a talk at Oslo a few years ago, 4 years ago, with the ex-prime minister of Norway, because he had, in his first term, had found out that he had bipolar. And it was, in Europe and in Scandinavia especially, it's really a no-no to admit as a professional, as a public figure, that you have some psychiatric problem. But he showed a lot of heroism there, I think, and he told everybody. He got treated, and he went on to have another whole term, term and a half that was fine. And so he gave a talk, and I was asked to give a talk on bipolar disorder, the kind of the neural circuitry, and also with a clinician who was an expert in bipolar. So the three of us gave public talks into the department, and it was in order to show how we do the kind of analysis we do. It's called imaging genetics, where you take brain imaging, like a PET scan or fMRI, and you put it mathematically in together with the genetics, and you find out what genes are associated with diseases. In this case, we're talking about bipolar. I couldn't show anybody else's, but I could show mine. So I showed my scans. I showed all of the things that I've had my whole life. That is all of my phenotype. That is my actual clinical and preclinical issues that I have, and my genetics to explain the technique. And at the end of it, the head of the department at the University of Oslo, he said, first of all, you're bipolar. You don't even know it because you're so hypomanic, which I've always known. But also, we want to talk to you afterwards. So after the talk, I met at the University of Oslo's, the rector's house, and a couple of psychiatrists told me, you might be a borderline psychopath too. I said, oh, that's great. It wasn't until that moment that I took it seriously, because even though I had this sort of objective biological evidence, that is the scans and the genetics, I didn't really take it seriously. But here are people who are psychiatrists who've seen the data and have talked to me, and they said there's something really wrong. And that's when I took it seriously. It was only a few years ago. And so almost, 4 years went by before I took this seriously. Then I came back and I started to talk to psychiatrists who analyzed me and who knew me some very long time. They knew all my kind of bad behaviors too. And they all told me the same thing. They said, we've been telling you for years you have all these psychopathic behaviors. I said, what the hell are you talking about? I said, I thought you said I was crazy. They said, you're not crazy, but you have a lot of psychopathic traits. Well, I mean, that's really when it first sort of hit me. And then I started talking in depth to my wife and my kids. Our kids are adults, and my close friends, and they all said the same thing. And then I was reminded of letters I was sent by people close to me on how cold I was and how unattached I was emotionally, without any empathy. And I had all of this now, not just biological evidence, but all of this professional sort of testing on psychopathy, and psychiatrists in the psychopathy test, and also personally, people who know me really well, and they all said the same thing, and it was staring me in the face. But, Michael, I got to tell you, at the end of that, I still didn't care, even though it was interesting. I found it interesting that I was this person that I didn't really know I was, and so that's how I came kicking and screaming to this.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting, because, I mean, you're a neuroscientist, and a lot of people have an image that anyone that might have psychopathic tendencies are going to be in jail, or they're going to be, hiding out in their mom's basement and clipping stuff in newspapers. I've even found that, I've written some fictional books, Freedom from Conscience series, in which the hero or the heroine is a pro-social psychopath. And people will say, well, but that totally, it gives an image that I'm not used to, that, usually these people are scary, and yet I love your character, or, those kinds of things.
Well, most
would
real
you say that there's an
psychopaths.
even divide? Is there like, if you use the term pro-social and antisocial psychopaths,
Right.
what's the percentage breakdown? Do you know, or are there a lot of people out there that people have as their favorite actor or actress or professor or politician that are probably psychopaths?
Well, yes, what you're saying is quite true, Michael. Now, if most people's view of what a psychopath is comes from TV and cinema, and from that, it was not very accurate descriptions of it, and it starts in the like 1915 up till the present day. It's not until the past about 10 years have there been really good descriptions, and especially in the last 5 years, of what real psychopaths are. Usually, it's been shown that they're, these impossible cartoon characters. There's a caricature of elements that you don't even find together. In some very popular things like Breaking Bad, the American TV series, very popular. Walter White is sort of put as a psychopath who becomes a psychopath at 50. First of all, that's the time people usually start losing their psychopathology, being a psychopath, is at about 50. But also the combinations of things are not really psychopaths. And you find this in most films. Now, except for things like, Wolf of Wall Street is quite good. One of the old ones, an old French film, actually an old German film, was M, with Peter Lorre. That's a pretty good portrayal. That was back in the 1930s. That was psychopath. And but most of them are these snarling, some of the older depictions, these violent sort of quite overtly evil, if you will, characters that are really not typical of your average your real psychopath. And a lot of them that have been shown from the 1970s, 80s, and even 90s are what they have antisocial personality disorder. ASPD is recognized universally as a real psychiatric disorder. A psychopath is not, and certainly not a sociopath. So they're not real disorders, but ASPD, antisocial personality disorder, about half of the psychopaths you see in film have that. Now, ASPD can be part of being a psychopath, but it's not really core psychopathy. Also, the criminality part of a psychopath is not really a core feature. Now, if you look at these the different aspects of it, you have separated into what would be, there's Hare's designation. Now, Hare's designation has different parts, two different factors, plus this kind of third factor that's included. And so the first factor for Hare, which is the one most used in forensics and you hear most of, and it was created on a prison population, first of all, of men. But the first factor has two parts to it. One has to do with the interpersonal relationships you have. And that is, people who have this superficial charm, they're glib, and they're very narcissistic. They can lie, they're very glib, and they're very manipulative. That's the interpersonal factor one. There's also a part of factor one that's called the affective, sort of what you'd call the emotional response. And in the case of psychopaths, they really lack guilt. They lack what's called emotional empathy. They may have cognitive empathy. That is, they know that what other people are feeling, but they don't care. The caring and the feeling of that is called emotional empathy, and it's the one you want in a mate and in a friend. But they don't have any of that. So they're very callous. They don't have any empathy, and they tend to externalize blame. So if something happens, they blame somebody else. That's the affective part of factor one. That first part, factor one, are most common in what would be called pro-social psychopaths. These traits, the glibness and the charm and this narcissism and the ego and the manipulation, and also the failure to show anxiety, really makes them navigate very well in regular life, in regular society, in jobs. People who are dominated by factor one are pro-social psychopaths. And they may not have many of these other, the factor 2 parts. Now, the factor 2, one is the antisocial personality disorder part, okay? And that has overlaps a lot with criminality and is really universally nasty. It's not pro-social at all. It's dangerous. People don't like it. People may like somebody who's really charming and glib, and we find that in leaders, too. It's one of the psychopathic traits that we love in our leaders. But antisocial ones, where it's very poor behavioral controls, they're very early on in their life, even before they're 10, will start getting into trouble, and they start to sexually abusing, let's say, little girls, and also cruel to animals. That sort of antisocial stuff is a really part of it. But there are psychopaths who don't have that, and they don't have the criminality. The other part of factor 2 is called lifestyle. And these are people who are impulsive, they're kind of irresponsible in their behavior, and they kind of wander through life. They don't really, these kind of people have a hard time holding down real jobs. And so pro-social psychopaths are just happy-go-lucky guys that are kind of in and out of jobs. They may be full psychopaths, and they may have these lifestyle problems. And they're kind of parasitic. They may keep moving in with different people, and they suck off of people, and they're very parasitic. And they don't have any long-term goals. But core pro-social psychopaths don't have that. They don't necessarily have that. And then there's these other parts of the psychopathy that are not part of factor 1 or factor 2. They're called just other items. And these are people, in males usually, very promiscuous, sexually promiscuous, and they're very, they can't keep relationships. They keep hopping from one person to another. And you might find that in both men and women. So at any rate, you can have these pro-social people, and those are the ones most likely to be around you and live their whole life without getting caught or being identified as a psychopath, because they can be so charming. And one interesting thing, Michael, is that because part of their brain that has to do with emotionality and empathy and the sense of morals and ethics, it's not developed. So, when a normal person is interacting with somebody, they usually think, is what I'm going to say hurting the other person's feelings, right? And it kind of slows you down when you have to think of, how is this going to affect this group, this other person? My behavior, what I'm saying. A psychopath doesn't have that, so they can very quickly talk. So part of seeming so intelligent, I think, is a little artificial, because they don't have to think about this extra loop in their brain, which is how you feel about other people. So they can just keep chattering away, and they don't show any sort of guilt. And so when you're talking to them, and when you're interacting, when the police pick them up, they don't seem guilty at all. They don't show any anxiety, and therefore people don't think they're guilty. But it's part of the core parts of this pro-social psychopath. Hey, this person doesn't seem guilty. He's not anxious. I confronted him with this, and so it actually helps them navigate through, again, pro-social. But really the ones that have been shown in most media have been the criminality things and the antisocial parts of it. Now, there was a time in the film and TV in the 1970s and 80s and 90s where they were shown to be very clever. And this is even with Hannibal Lecter, is this like super smart, suave, sophisticated guy, like James Bond. And James Bond's a psychopath who's got antisocial personality disorder. A very good rendition of a pro-social psychopath is James Bond, and a good rendition of a real psychopath, a dangerous psychopath, is Goldfinger himself. So that was actually a good sort of pairing in a comedy, if you will. Now, but if you look at Hannibal Lecter, it's an impossible character, and nobody knows. Psychiatrists and people I know that know film and TV and psychiatry, somebody like that doesn't exist, nor does somebody like Walter White in Breaking Bad. Nobody like that exists. So they're really caricatures, and they're not true to form. The other kinds that we see that are supposed to be psychopaths are in these slasher films. These in a chainsaw murder, Texas Chainsaw Murder films, and any of these kind of the teenage sort of slashers, they're not psychopaths. Now, some of the people they may have antisocial personality disorder in these films and TV, but they also have probably what's called intermittent explosive disorder, where all of a sudden they explode with this violence and then feel bad about it afterwards. That's not a psychopath. A real person who has that is President Assad of Syria. He had intermittent explosive disorder as a kid, and it probably has to do with his fits of when he gets into a rage and he does some crazy stuff. But it's not psychopathy. Now, so there are some good examples of psychopathy in film and in TV, but it doesn't sell. See, the thing is, people want these violent, dangerous, mastermind sorts of psychopaths that do these bizarre things that are sadistic. There's nothing in psychopaths that says that you have to be sadistic. Sadism isn't part of it. So, a sadistic personality, which has formed part of what we think of as being a psychopath, is not a core part of it. It's not psychopathy at all. But people who are psychopaths that the average person would run into, and if you're in a group of 35 people, 37 people, the chances are that exactly one of them will be a real full-blown psychopath. But in the general population, there's probably 1 to 2%, 1 or 2 out of 100 of people are going to be full-blown psychopaths. But borderline psychopaths, and the ones that you're working around, there may be up 5-6% of them. So people, everybody knows them. If there's somebody in their family, in their extended family, probably is at least a borderline psychopath, and certainly people they work with. But the chances are they're going to be more like the Wolf of Wall Street, or like the Wall Street character Gordon Gekko himself, than one of these snarling, violent psychopaths.
Well, that's actually interesting. When you look at the pro-social aspects, because, for instance, I ran across an article that was done a few years ago that was listing psychopathic traits in U.S. presidents, and I noticed there was an irony that the top 4 presidents that were supposed to be the most psychopathic, and this, of course, went up to Bush and stopped there, was Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, and John F. Kennedy.
Right. Those are the big 4. And that was on this. See, the Hare test is used for criminals, right? Well, this PPI. This is the psychopathy check, not the psychopathy checklist, but the psychopathy personality inventory. This is used for normal people and to check for traits. So the PPI was given to the biographers of all the U.S. presidents, and they ranked them according to this one thing, which is called fearless dominance. Now, fearless dominance of the PPI is like that first factor in Hare. It's the pro-social part, and that fearless dominance has to do with their social dominance and charm, and physically they're fearless, and they're completely immune to anxiety. That's separate from the what's called impulsive antisociality part of the PPI, which is like the factor 2 of Hare. But if we go back to the U.S. presidents, the ones that score very high in this fearless dominance, those, like you said, the top of the list is Teddy Roosevelt, and Clinton is right up there in the top 7. After you get down to George W. Bush, is down around number 10. His father, George Bush the first, very low in psychopathy, has almost none. He's like Jimmy Carter. But also people like Gerald Ford. And these are the mensches. The problem is, and here's the key to this, the second interesting point about that study you're talking about on U.S. presidents, is that all these people that have very high psychopathy are the ones that have what are perceived as the greatest leadership skills. So it's like the average voter, the average citizens like these people. And we tend to vote them in. They're very popular, and they're charming. So it's like the public is asking for psychopathy. And they're the heads of corporations too. They can have this. Doesn't mean they're full psychopaths, but they have this fearless dominance part that we see as being very, very positive.
So essentially, in that respect, I mean, if you look at it from an evolutionary psychology viewpoint, I mean, personality traits, they may have their negative, but they also have their positive that has caused them to be passed on through generations. So maybe many of our, if we admire certain traits in people as leaders, maybe this is an explanation as to why psychopathy has remained in the human population.
Oh yeah, I agree, Michael. I did a talk this year in Oslo on Putin. I was asked to do kind of an analysis. We don't have his psychiatric reports. They do exist, and I know, and I've talked to people who know that, but you have to infer it through the diplomatic talk. It's kind of hidden in some language. But if you just look at him, he does not look like a psychopath at all. And but he has these traits because he's basically an extension. He's a rebirth of the Tsar's secret police. It's not really Soviet so much as it is a Russian thing. And the people like him. The Russian people like him. They like that personality, and he has this macho part of it, which there are some portrayals of psychopaths as macho, but being macho, it overlaps with this fearless dominant stuff for sure. But in a way, it's these democratically voted in people. Even Hitler was voted in democratically, but no psychiatrist has ever been able to state that he was really a psychopath. It's a reflection of the people at that time and what their fears and their desires and their hatreds were. And so if you look at them, a lot of people don't vote. There's sort of a genetic impossibility of fully participatory democracy because half of the people just want to live their lives with their family. They're not really participating. But there are about 20% of the people who have these highly aggressive traits end up running things. They run companies. They run countries. And, one organization I'm involved with as an advisor, they're very closely allied with people who are in the opposition governments to countries around the world who have dictators or tyrants. So they're part of, the opposition governments. But the thing is, people in the opposition may be just as bad or worse than the people in power. And so I'm asked to just make comments on that. But if you look at some of these traits, they're not psychopathic. It's just they're this fearless dominant stuff that we like and we seem to need. And the question is, as part of when talking to people who analyze these leaders, who would take the job? Everybody thinks, well, I could be president, I could be prime minister. No, you can't, because you have to have this pressure of energy nonstop for years, and that takes a narcissistic personality. It takes this fearless dominance and this imperviousness, this coldness, because if you are empathetic, you'll never get anything done. So by its very nature, the job calls from psychopathy. It's like, so who else would do it except somebody with a lot of these pro-social psychopathic traits, which are leadership?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that could explain, too, if there is a certain impulsivity that's associated with it. I know that during the late 90s, there was a whole bunch of scandals. Well, there was the Bill Clinton one with Monica Lewinsky, but there was others as well in both parties. And there was these questions about why would people that are famous, that are in the limelight, be taking risk like that? And
it's all part of the whole package.
Yeah, you can't, if you want someone who's going to be an administrative type, like you kind of say, like a Gerald Ford or a first George Bush, they're probably also going to come with all the nice stuff about being loyal to their wife and not taking risk and things.
But they're not considered leaders. And so with leaders, now the Russian people tend to accept that. If they, in the times where they said, that the Russian president had all these affairs, a lot of the Russian people would say, that's great, we need somebody strong, we need somebody aggressive, we need somebody who can have sex with a lot of people. Well, this is a true reflection of, I think, the evolution of humans. There was always a small group of people, maybe 20%, that had these traits, that also were able to go across to the other side of the mountain, leave their group, and have sex with as many people as they could. Genghis Khan, all the way to many, probably throughout history. And so they're aggressive this way. But to ask, usually people want to have impossible people. So in movie and film, we have impossible psychopaths. but we also have impossible good guys that just don't exist because the impossible good guys, women don't tend to find them attractive to begin with. They're pussycats, and they're just kind of, they're not exciting.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought up James Bond because I've noted that in some previous programs, and also the Clint Eastwood character in a lot of those westerns from the 70s.
Right. The one part of if Hervé, Hervé, I think it was in 2003 or something, he wrote about another classification of psychopathy, which is pretty useful for looking at film characters too, film and TV characters. And from that, it was basically there are 4 types, according to that classification, Hervé's. And the one is kind of the classic prototypical, or what's called idiopathic psychopath. The primary psychopath who's kind of genetically born with those traits, but then becomes a psychopath because maybe of early abuse or abandonment, right? That's the classic so-called primary psychopath, is this idiopathic one. The next kind, which is the one that would be more like the Wolf of Wall Street or Gordon Gekko, which is the manipulative type. And these people are rarely violent, but they become very effective as money managers and the heads of corporations, and even as politicians. That's a second manipulative type. And then there's what's called the pseudo-psychopath, or I guess it's more like what people would think of as a sociopath. That is, they're not born evil. In other words, they're not really born genetically with the bullets to load the gun of psychopathy. So they're not naturally that way, but because of early abuse, they're really angry and they're getting even with the world. And so somebody like a Hitler or Stalin might be like a pseudo-psychopath, or what people think of as a sociopath. But the third kind is called a macho. It's a macho psychopath. And the macho psychopath is, and there are many film heroes that are this kind of macho type. Al Capone in The Untouchables. That would be one. Goldfinger was more like a macho one. I don't know who else.
Well, in modern TV series.
Modern, yeah. I guess Hatcher in the movie Rundown, and who else? Sleeping with the Enemy, that the Bernie character. I mean, I'm sorry. He might be thought of as, but somebody like from Pulp Fiction. Marcellus Wallace was a macho psychopath.
Mm-hmm.
But, Michael Corleone would be a macho psychopath. And, who else? I guess, in Sergeant Barnes in Platoon, that's a macho type. Goodfellas, Tommy DeVito is considered macho.
Yeah, and these kind of characters resonate with both men and women when they're on TV or the movies.
Well, the macho ones, of the ones analyzed as real psychopaths, nobody's been able to really find a real psychopath with a macho thing. But, it's I disagree with that. I would agree with you that there are some that are true macho types. So, but there are really not so many. But can you come up with a couple that you'd say would really?
What do you mean macho as in pushy or aggressive?
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. Well, I guess you could say Terminator. He didn't have any empathy.
No, right. Well, you see, in the characters that are analyzed in this way, they kind of toss out robots and any, cartoons and robots. But you're right. If you include that would be, somebody with that. If you look at One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Nurse Ratched is one of the great evil characters in all film, in American film. But she's more manipulative, in a way macho, but she's manipulative, right? That's a manipulative psychopath.
Are women more likely to be the ones that are psychopaths? Are they more likely to be the manipulative type?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. In real life too.
Yeah, and there's I think there's a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 men to every 1 woman who's a psychopath.
Yeah. two or 3 to 1 men over versus women psychopaths in the population.
Do you think there could be a problem? I've heard this before. I don't know if it, I just wanted to ask your opinion, that some borderline, women are often diagnosed with borderline, and that some borderlines are actually psychopaths, but psychiatry is still kind of is affected by the cultural idea that, well, femininity and psychopathy don't go together.
Well, Michael, you are in the know, man. You know what you're talking about. That is true. It's, there's in psychiatry there is the suspicion that there are this group of murderers, and especially found in women. There's first psychopaths, or ASPD, really, antisocial personality disorder, but then for women, borderlines, and fatal attraction. Glenn Close's character, that's a borderline, and these people that are that either they love you, then they hate you, they're very attached, they become disappointed and everything. They can be very manipulative, and they're bored. Many of them are also they're borderlines, but it is maybe the expression, like you're saying, of psychopathy in women because they won't use the other traits as much. Now, this is one of the problems with the term psychopath and why it's not accepted by psychiatrists as a thing, because it overlaps with too many other personality disorders and traits. So even though those traits that are listed, that I mentioned, that you mentioned, those are accepted, but how they're put together, into a taxonomy of diseases, it overlaps with too many other disorders, so it's not quite accepted. So really, for us in research, look more toward what's called a dimensionality view of these disorders. So we take the traits and score them like a 0 to 10 or 0 to 5 scale, and then we use those traits and statistically align them with different genes, different not only behaviors but also their background and their diagnosis, and that's much more fruitful and much more repeatable than this categorical sort of definition of are you a psychopath or not, or are you a pro-social psychopath, because you're talking about people with clusters of traits, and of course you can mix and match these. So this whole way of looking at the psychopath as a categorical thing is coming into more and more doubt, but it's so much part of present day thinking and in the culture and in the medical insurance and in psychiatrists minds and the public's minds and in the court system. It's going to take a while for the people our age who are using that in our generation to die, and for people who've really learned the new genetics, new psychiatry, who are now maybe in their 30s and 40s, to replace that. But it may take 20 years before it's accepted, because you have to wait for a whole large group of people in law and in medicine and insurance to die, because they just it's too hard for somebody, a psychiatrist who is 60 years old, to go and learn all the new genetics and learn all the statistics and everything. It's very difficult for them to be professional. So I'm not blaming them, but that's what it's going to take.
Okay, and this brings me. We have about 5 minutes, it seems, and it brings me to something I wanted to cover, and that is, I know you're not supposed to take the test on your own, but people do it anyway. And I've known people that have taken the hair checklist test and so forth, and most all of them get like 0 to 5 or that category. There's not a lot of like 10, 15 types, but there's usually a number of people, a small minority, but a number of people that score in like the 20 to 25 range.
Right.
And I've heard it said that these might actually be the more, I hate to use this term, but the more dangerous range, because these people probably have enough empathy to be able to then not just use cognitive empathy when dealing with people, but they recognize enough emotion that they can also bring in an element of creativity and empathy that maybe a person that scores 35 or 40 would not be able to use in a social situation.
Yeah, I agree. There are, first of all, most people score 0, 1, or 2 points on it, and if it's done correctly, You can't. The problem with people taking it themselves is they tend to overrank them, overrank their score sometimes on different things because, and it's also you have to look at the context dependence of this because somebody who is a salesman is supposed to be manipulative and glib and all that. It's part of the job, and everybody knows that. They're not fooling anybody really, and that doesn't really count. And so sometimes the traits by themselves out of context don't count. Likewise, if you take a kid from, let's say, a wealthy area or middle-class suburban area, the behavior of that person, and you compare it to somebody in a dangerous part of a city, well, they're not the same behaviors because the kid's behavior in the city may be just to survive, and so it wouldn't be counted as psychopathic really like it would be in a kid who was brought up in a non-dangerous area. And so there's that. Plus, one question is, do you manipulate people just because you're trying to get something, or do you do it naturally? So some people just do this naturally. That's a personality trait. And so all of these things can skew the tests. And so you're right. But people have to watch it. The self-taking of tests doesn't really work out so well. It's kind of a fun parlor game, but the best thing is really to be analyzed by a psychiatrist or two. Now, and so the people you're talking about, the borderlines, are people who will have these factor 1 and maybe some of the factor 2, like impulsivity and some irresponsible behavior, like some of our presidents. But it only will score them about a 20 or 23 or 4, but because they don't have any sort of this antisocial stuff and criminality. Now, the thing is, the people who do have a full psychopathy, they have pretty disorganized lives, and they're caught. Do you know what I mean? They get caught, and unless they're hiding in a mountain or something, and so they tend to get caught. And in fact, a lot of them tend to get caught when they're 15 years old or 18. They're in the system, and so those people are in the prison population. But the people who don't have a lot of that ASPD, the antisocial personality disorder, and the criminality, well, they can go on their whole life and not get caught. Those are the people that most people run into and will steal the pants off you and will manipulate you into doing things that are not quite good for you. And you're right. Those are the people that people should be really looking out for, not Hannibal Lecter.
But they probably won't eat you.
That's right. That's exactly.
Okay. Well, I know you told me you had a busy schedule here, so I'd like to really, really thank you for sharing these insights. Very fascinating material.
Great talking to you, Michael. And you know what you're talking about. You're really quite ahead of the whole thing. So that's great.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Well, then I'd like to also thank my listening audience for tuning in and invite you to come back next week for another episode of Unlock the Door Radio. Okay, well, that was an excellent interview there with James Fallon. And just a few things I just point out here. The first is I really think that what he has to say about not just psychopaths, but also the people that are close to being psychopaths is very vital in really understanding the way the political system works. And that people not just automatically assume that things like personality disorders are in some way some sort of handicap for people. I think I've said this before in some shows, that there are various personality disorders that on the face of it, people think, oh my gosh, that must be a really horrible thing to have to live with. And maybe it is for people, but it also, all of these personality disorders, whether you see them as a problem when it comes to genetics or society, or maybe as a gift from God, even, these personality disorders seem to help people in various walks of life. Schizotypal personality disorder. I mean, I would really like to get a group of artists or musicians or people that are very creative in any of the arts or innovators, really, really unusual innovators in, for instance, computer science, and see how far they score on inventories dealing with what we label, what psychology has labeled, a personality disorder. I would say they score very high indeed. People challenging the system. Well, think about such things as borderline personality disorder, BPD. These people have problems in relationships, but at the same time, often these are the people who will really stir things up in the workplace or in a political setting. And we need that. We need that kind of variety. And when it comes to psychopathic behavior, well, the people that are willing to take risk. Now, they may, on the face of it, seem like cutthroats and people that will plow people over to get what they want. But at the same time, sometimes that's what's necessary. And I'm going to do a future show on just, the advantages of psychopathy. Now, I'm not saying everyone should go out and hug a psychopath or something like that. The thing I'm trying to say is that we often associate good qualities with anti-heroes, and anti-heroes are quite often psychopaths. I like what he said, about James Bond. In fact, he's not just a psychopath, he's a sociopath. The thing is that these characters, we see the value in them just going headstrong, kind of a die-hard Bruce Willis type character who flies through the streets in a big semi-truck, just smashing all the cars and trying to reach their goal. But, we could also see that, if you're in one of those cars, if it was a real-life thing, it would not be so good. But at the same time, we need these kinds of people. Now, so I don't want to just go on a witch hunt against people with this particular disorder. But the thing is, we should try to recognize who they are, what they are, and then not idealize people, whether we agree with them or not. Because I'll tell you right now, I don't think there's any difference between the two parties when it comes to how many people in leadership positions have psychopathic or sociopathic tendencies. Okay, if you're climbing your way to the top, even at, I would say, something at the level of state legislature, I really think you're going to have to score high on these inventories. And again, I would really encourage people to look up the Hare inventory. There's tests out there. I think it's interesting. I have given this test to lots and lots and lots of people. And usually I'll get about 1 in 30 who will score high, higher than James Fallon says he scored. He scored, He scored around a 20 or so on it, or in the low 20s. And I've had people score 23, 24. Some of the questions may have something to do with the person's personal preferences. For instance, one of the questions, remember, it's just 20 questions. 20 questions to give an idea of where your personality traits are. I have seen that one of them is that you score high on sexual promiscuity. But yet, I've mentioned before in some of the radio shows, I did one recently about my book series, I made sure that in at least the first book, in the Freedom from Conscience series, and if you haven't checked it out, check it out. Just go ahead and type in Freedom from Conscience and see what you find. You might be a psychological thriller that you would find interesting because it just doesn't deal with politics or psychopathy or philosophy. It deals with all those things. But it does so in a first-person narrative that gives you an idea of how these people actually think. Now, the thing is that in the first book, the main character, a young female, 17, turns 18 during the course of the slice of time that I deal with in the novel. She is not promiscuous. In fact, she is far from it. But her personal motivation is cognitive. She doesn't want to just go out there and screw around with anything and everything in sight, like a lot of people do. And so I think that's going to be true for a lot of people with psychopathy. They're not going to be the kind of people who just, they see a conquest and they go for it just because it's there. I mean, there's got to have some sort of meaning to it, or else it's too easy. Now, again, there are some psychopaths, I'm sure, that does not bother them, but there is a certain level, especially cognitive psychopaths, the ones that are really, really, really cerebral, the Hannibal Lecter type, if you want to, again, go back to a television or movie character. These kinds of people may be very selective in who they want to have a relationship with, more selective than the average person would be. And so if someone's taking one of these tests, if my fictional character, Melanie Johnson, was taking this test and came across the question of sexual promiscuity, she would write down a 0. And that would be something that would count against being a psychopath. But ultimately, there are some questions, but ultimately, most of the questions I think are quite valid. Do you have this kind of charm that you can shut off or turn on at will? Do you have do you have the ability to convince people really easily, to be able to read an audience, to be able to read an individual just right off? I remember Ronald Reagan once in an interview where he said that he decided to get into politics because he noticed that he could read an audience and what they wanted to hear very easily. He could psychoanalyze an audience. Now, I like Ronald Reagan, but if someone were to tell me he was a psychopath, it wouldn't take away from my liking him. At the same time, there are other Democratic presidents, who I am quite sure were psychopaths, and I didn't like them. Or maybe they'd be the kind of people you feel like, hey, I wouldn't mind going fishing with this guy, but I sure wouldn't trust him. And so it transcends party. But then that leaves us a really weird dilemma, doesn't it? That we're ultimately, when we're selecting people for higher office, we want to select people who will get in there and fight like a psychopath would, to plow through, again, using that Bruce Willis Die Hard and scene, driving through the streets in a semi, just not worrying about everyone you're smashing in their cars through. Well, the thing is, I noticed that, for instance, in the last election, Romney and Obama, and I'm not going to, I've had some guests on that have made some comments about Obama and so forth, but let's just say this. Romney, I think, was just trying to be I think he was trying to be too nice. I think he was just trying to be the nice Mormon boy who was going to do the right thing. Now, is he a psychopath? I have no clue. I've heard some people in alternative media call him that. But the thing is, he was still not allowing himself to go off the handle like maybe a Newt Gingrich type, kind of that Irish bulldog type of attack person. And you know what? Those few times that Romney actually let loose on Obama, his poll numbers would go up. But then he was just trying to be Mr. Nice Guy. And his poll numbers flatlined. And then when the hurricane took place and Obama was able to steal all that publicity, it went down. Maybe, seriously, if Romney runs again, and I've heard rumors that he's going to run again, don't know if it's true or not, someone should send him, one of these books out there about, what we can learn from psychopaths and that sort of thing. Because you don't win the public's love and admiration by being Mr. Nice Guy. Nice guys finish last. It doesn't mean you go in there and, be, cruel and mean and nasty, because that's not going to win you over either. You have to have that kind of finesse, that charm that psychopaths have in order to get people to like you. Now, that's sad, but yeah, the people we put up to run for office are essentially just like the old-fashioned gunslingers. You hire the guy for the job because you don't want to do it. And the thing is that these psychopaths are, the ones that have ethics behind them, that have a certain set of, okay, this is what I want done, or I'll do this from a Machiavellian point of view, so I'll get reelected. You want that. And maybe the person's not a psychopath. Maybe they just score high. Maybe they're one of those people that's in between. They get that 17 to 24 range on those tests, which is way higher. As James Fallon pointed out, the average person could score maybe 0 or 1 or 2 or 3. Most people I've given this test to score between 0 and 5. 1 in 30 score in the upper levels. I've never had anyone actually score. Never met anyone personally who scored above 25. But I have gotten some that have come close. And they are the kind of people who are very good at debate, very charming. If you told them to debate one side or another, they could do it with ease. They could switch sides immediately. So that's the problem. You don't know if they're genuine, but if you have the idea they are, then that's what you're going to be going for, and that seems to be what we're going to get stuck with in a country that's going to be governed by the soundbite, or having that little clever James Bond type statement that makes everyone, very almost dark humor, but makes everyone laugh and love you, even though you're joking about throwing someone into a meat grinder. That seems to be what people want. So anyway, I promise I'll do a show here in the next maybe 2 to 3 weeks that will deal with psychopathy and what we can learn, what we can apply without actually having to be one, or having to jettison our morals like in some sort of Machiavellian sense. But anyway, I think that'll be an interesting show. Anyway, thank you for tuning in tonight. And hope you're coming back next week. Tell some of your friends to tune in as well. Anyway, this is Michael Cross signing off for Unlock the Door Radio.
For more news, visit pigminews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UC